sorry, I was talking to myself. I'll start again. Welcome everyone to this Matter 8 session on natural resources. If you could have your microphones switched off and your videos until it's your turn to speak, and to indicate when you wish to speak by raising your hand. This is being recorded and live streamed now to YouTube, so please be aware of the Council's privacy policies. If we move straight on to introducing who is going to speak in this session, please, starting with the Council.
Good morning, Madam. Mark Beard here, Counsel to the Local Planning Authority. I'll be speaking during this session, and we have 3 other speakers who will introduce themselves now.
Thank you.
Ian Gillespie, Interim Planning Policy Manager.
Ian Motchell, Principal Policy Officer.
Eric Isnengi, WSP supporting the Council on Flood Risk.
Thank you. And I'll call out the names of others I have on my list, and then if there's anyone further, we'll take those at the end. So Mr. Scott. Do we have Mr. Scott?
Sorry, Mark. Morning.
Good morning.
Yeah, Kevin Scott from Solve Planning, acting for the Shanley Group. Possibly worth just mentioning, in the agenda, it says Summerlees against Solve Planning. Just to clarify, that's to do with HA24 site of Summerlees Gravel. And I notice Bart and Wilmore are appearing also on behalf of Summerlees Gravel Company. I'm here representing Shanley Homes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Bond.
Good morning, ma'am. It's Douglas Bond from Wolf Bond Planning, representing the landowners of AL14, the Triangle site.
Thank you. Ms. Anderson.
Helen Sanderson, Planning Advisor at the Environment Agency, leading on planning policy today. I'm joined by my colleague Brianne Valley, who will introduce herself now.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Brianne Valley. I'm employed by the Environment Agency as a flood and coastal risk advisor since January 2016. I'm here to provide technical flood risk inputs as appropriate.
Thank you. Sorry, could I just ask, was it Miss Sanderson or Miss Anderson? I have.
It's Miss Sanderson with an S.
With an S, thank you. And the S is missing from my list, but I sort of, thank you very much. Sorry about that. And do we have Miss Else?
Good morning, Catherine Els of Claremont Planning, representing European Property Ventures and promoting their land at HA41 north of Churchmead School at Datchet.
Thank you. And Ms. Cook?
Good morning, ma'am. Mary Cook, representing IM Land, who are interested in Spencer's Wood, the allocation at AL25 and also AL28.
Thank you. Is Miss Caldwell here as well?
Oh.
Morning, Alison Caldwell. I'm WSP working with IM Land in behalf of allocations AL25 and AL28.
Thank you. Monsieur?
Good morning. I'm Fiona Hewer. I'm here as the chair of Wild Maidenhead.
Thank you. And Ms. Cohen?
Good morning, ma'am. Kim Cohen from Barton Wilmore, here on behalf of Summerlees Limited in relation to AL26.
Thank you. And anybody else? No. Thank you. In that case, we'll move on with the agenda. I think the bulk of the agenda is going to be on NR1, flood risk matters. Now, this really concerns what to do about the Lower Thames model, the January 2020 model. And I'd originally raised this under Matter 11, the site-specific session, but there's a lot to talk about there. And I think it would be really useful to start now. So we don't have an awful lot of time, and my intention is not to go into an individual site analysis in this session, or indeed into masses of technical detail, because there won't be time. And also, I think I assume that ends up being right for one site out of fairness will probably be right for the others. So it's more what we should do with this model. So my overall question is, we've got a new model. Should we use it at this stage? And if so, how should we use it? And sort of overall, I think, if people are proposing that the model should be used, is it a whole rerun of all the sequential tests and everything that went with it, or can we just look at some sort of site-specific factors if it's raising issues about the sites that are proposed to be allocated in the plan? Now, I don't know whether it's helpful, but I thought I might just outline a couple of things that I've picked up perhaps from the sequential test documents and other things, just so you have a little bit of an idea of the types of things I'm thinking about, in case that helps. So I've looked, for example, at the sequential test model, and I think my understanding of that is that 23 out of the 37 sites proposed to be allocated are in flood zone 1. In any case, only 5 require, this is for housing, of course, only 5 require the exception test. And then I've had a look, the lowest percentage, I think, of land in flood zone 1 on any one site is 65%, and the highest in flood zone 3A seem to be about 6.5%. So I kind of want to ask about, how significant is this? How significant can any change be for these allocations? Is it really significant in terms of potentially running the whole site allocation process? Because presumably, unless anything shows itself to be in flood zone 1 that's been missed, then most of the things we've got are already in flood zone 1 anyway. So they're the sorts of things I want to be pragmatic about this, but address anything that needs to be done in the best and most efficient way, really, at this stage of the examination. So those are the sorts of thoughts in my mind. So perhaps if I could turn to the council first of all, and then perhaps hear from the Environment Agency before turning to others. Thank you.
Madam, thank you. That's very helpful indeed. And
Mr. Beard,
we certainly support approaching this matter in a...
Mr. Beard, I can't hear you properly.
See if I can't make that. Give me a second.
Well, he's just reconnecting to a different Wi-Fi, I think.
Yeah, I think that's it. It's very slow. You're very clear, but that's...
Just let me have, can you hear me now?
Yes, that's much better. Yep.
I'll take it slowly. Please let me know if you can't hear me. I'll restart, madam. Thank you very much for your introduction, which is helpful. We too support the pragmatic approach that you propose, and I propose to begin just by setting the context in which we see this issue, but also setting out our position regarding the matters to which you've just referred. And no doubt the officers who are available to speak will follow up as need be. It's right, first of all, to acknowledge that the Council and the Environment Agency have worked and continue to cooperate and work constructively on matters relating to flood risk since the stage 1 hearings. It's also right to acknowledge that the Council and the Environment Agency have been preparing a second statement of common ground, which we trust will assist you when that is complete. It's right to say it's at an advanced stage of preparation. There are a few matters that need to be ironed out before we can that will be signed. As your hearing agenda questions acknowledge, and the timing of the release of the Lower Thames flood model was beyond the Council's control, and we know that was made available at the beginning of this year. The relevant history is outlined in our pre-hearing statement for matter 11 at pages 9 and 10. And Madam, you're familiar with that history, so I do not propose to address it in detail this morning. A few important points, however, are worth mentioning. And the statement of common ground signed by the agency and ourselves in October of 2018, and as we know, that's document PS 041, confirmed that both parties' agreement that the Council's plan making should continue to have regard to the published 2009 based flood information until the new Lower Thames flood model was officially released. It's important here to emphasize that when the Statement of Common Ground was signed back in October of 2018, the parties anticipated that the new Lower Thames flood model will be published by the agency before the end of 2018, thereby enabling the council to use the updated flooding information when reviewing site selections in accordance with your advice. In the circumstances, the council had no option other than to continue with the review of its site selection work using the then available published information. And as you'll recall, Madam, the council's then head of planning explained the circumstances of how the council was proceeding with the work when providing you progress updates in the course of 2019. Turning then briefly to the council's position, as we had no option to continue with that work in the circumstances, we say that the proposed changes plan was prepared having regard to the best available information and robust evidence. Accordingly, you can be satisfied that the proposed changes plan has been prepared in accordance with national policy in the 2012 framework and associated planning practice guidance, some of which of course is archived. As such, you can also be satisfied that the site allocations in the plan itself are underpinned by adequate and appropriate sequential testing, and where appropriate, exception testing. That work required, and the work required to address and overcome the soundness issues relating to flood risks that you identified in your stage 1 hearings or post stage 1 hearings advice was very substantial. And as you know, Madam, that took over 12 months for the council to complete. As Mr. Gillespie has made clear earlier in these hearing sessions, since December 2018, when this Statement of Common Ground was agreed, a plethora of flood modelling information and mapping information has been released by the agency, some of which was interim information, some was later withdrawn and also superseded. Now, of course, as a responsible local planning authority, the RBWM could not sensibly be expected to delay the progression of that crucial plan making work or this examination. And as we all know, the reason for that is to secure the adoption of the borough local plan as soon as possible. And of course, doing otherwise would be directly contrary, we say, to the public interest. So thinking about or referring then to your questions and the matters that you've mentioned this morning, we say that the Environment Agency's request that the sequential testing and the exception test where necessary should be revisited before the plan is adopted is neither realistic nor reasonable. The council's view, the prospect of a further long delay, the likes of which would be similar, we think, to potentially similar to that that was caused by the need to do the work that was undertaken last year, is simply a non-starter. It would take too long, and it's unacceptable to delay the adoption of the plan by a period of months. We, of course, however, have not been blind to the implications of the new flood model and mapping information that's been released progressively over the past year, including most recently the Thames tributaries model, which was released in August of 2020. And in the circumstances, we acknowledge that although there have been changes to the flood mapping and the extent of flood zones, that the extent within the proposed changes plan site allocations has been considered by the council and needs to be, and regard should be paid to those changes in the course of this examination. And we were proposing for that reason, and for the reasons you've mentioned this morning, that subject to your agreement, that we provide you with a short note that demonstrates that the site allocations within the plan are deliverable, remain deliverable, as does the plan for that matter, and dealing to the extent that it's necessary with any material changes to the flood zone extents within site allocations that you ought to have regard to when carrying out your examination. But to make absolutely clear, the purpose of doing that work would be to demonstrate that in all cases, the site allocations are deliverable, as I've said, but also the yield of development. And what I mean by that obviously is in particular the number of homes, but also the floor space for any economic development that's proposed in site allocations will certainly be delivered, and there's no question that or no reason to question that will be the case as proposed over the planned period. Madam, I hope those introductory remarks are helpful for your purposes. I don't know if you have any questions arising from those opening remarks that perhaps Mr. Gillespie could assist you with.
Only one, and that is just that just if you can give me a little bit more of an understanding of how difficult it would be to rerun that sequential test. And I'm not suggesting you should do this. I just want to, Mr. Beard has outlined that it would cause a significant delay. How do you actually physically rerun this sort of flood risk model, say over the whole lot of 300 and something sites that were originally put in, or indeed in relation to these 37? And what extent of work is it? Just like pushing a button and up they all pop, or what happens?
Madam, I think it might be helpful to hear from Mr. Isnegi on that one.
Thank you.
Yes, is a time-consuming exercise because essentially we will need to take into account the number of hydraulic models that have come out from the environmental agency over the last few months. Essentially, the general lower Thames model, including the lower Thames tributaries model. So it's a range of different hydraulic models that will need to be considered, and all the sites will need to be reassessed against those modeling results to verify how they rank in terms of flood risk. That would be the starting point. And then we will need to rerun the assessment for the site located in the floodplain in flood zone 2 and 3 to essentially provide support to the exception test and to the sequential test, demonstrating that those sites could be developed in a safe way. So essentially, there is a reassessment that has to be done for every site which is brought forward to demonstrate that the principle of safety and ensuring that no flood risk is increased as well are maintained. Essentially, a reassessment of all the sites. So it's a time-consuming exercise which would take a significant amount of time.
But I think, just to check my understanding of what Mr. Beard was saying, Mr. Beard, I think, suggested that you would be looking again at the sites that are proposed to be allocated. Is that a much more manageable task? And would you be doing that in detail for each of those 37 sites? Or what would
a high-level review of the flood mapping for specific sites, for selected sites which have been allocated, can be done in a much easier way because you can compare what has already been done with what is happening now with the new modeling to identify whether there are significant issues or just adjustment to be done in terms of the advice and in terms of the quantum of potential development available in those areas, which is a different thing from reassessing the entire 300 sites and reclassify them based on the flood risk ranking.
Okay.
Can I just add to that, Ma'am, in terms of the planning process that Mark Beard has outlined, was that we would look at the sites again and see which may be impacted upon by the most up-to-date flooding information. And the idea would be to prepare a note for you that would identify where any of that new information may impact upon the yield that might be achievable from those sites. And the purpose of the exercise overall is to demonstrate that all of the sites in the plan together would still be more than capable of meeting the housing requirement and the employment needs of the borough. And we fully expect that in a few cases we may see some minor variation in the developable area as a result of the new flood modelling. But in reality, that will come through at the development management stage. We will need to do a detailed, or the applicant will need to do a detailed site-specific assessment, and we will need to identify the areas within those sites that are suitable for development. And in a few cases, we may find that where we've estimated a yield of, say, 100 dwellings, it may be only possible to accommodate 80 in light of the more up-to-date flood modelling. But it's almost a sensitivity analysis, I suppose, is probably the best way to put it. We would look again at this latest data and provide you with the reassurance that in overall terms, the sites remain suitable for allocation and together are capable of delivering the development needs set out in the plan.
Okay, and but just before I turn to the EA, on the sort of flip side of that, what's the risk in not running the whole lot again? What's the risk that that could turn up some brilliant sites that were previously not included because they were low down in the sequential test that say we're all wholly in flood zone 1 and you'd ignore those? What's the risk of that happening?
I think extremely low, Mum. Extremely low.
Why is that?
And why is that? Well, this plan has been in preparation, Mum, for far longer than I've been involved. But the challenge has always been to identify sites that are unconstrained.
No, sorry. So what I'm specifically asking is it likely that the new model will, will take some sites that were previously in flood zone 2 or 3 out and they'll be in flood zone 1 all of a sudden by virtue of the new model?
My understanding is that the flood extent increases as a result of the new information. There are areas where the flood extent changes, but in overall terms, the area at risk of flooding increases. Okay. I can hand you over to my colleague who probably has a better understanding of that.
If you would, and then maybe I'll ask the Environment Agency, because that's fine. Brilliant, thank you.
Okay, it's difficult to say without analyzing in detail all the modeling results. What we know is that flood risk is concentrated along the water courses, so definitely there would be some tweaks, some changes in the floodplain extent. Some areas in flood zone 1 might move into flood zone 2 and vice versa, but it's not expected, it's unlikely that we will discover that all the assumptions in the previous model are wrong, and as such massive changes in terms of floodplain extent and areas that are located in flood zone 1 and 2 and 3 would happen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Perhaps if I could turn now to the Environment Agency to get their take on it, and then we'll hear from others who wish to speak. So Ms. Sanderson or Ms. Valley?
Hello. So we covered most of this in our MIQ response. I'm just going to highlight the key points that we raised there. We believe the evidence should be used now to assess the implications on the allocated sites. Without doing this, the local plan would not be justified using the most up-to-date evidence available, and there would be no assurance that it would be effective, as we don't know if the sites are deliverable as they are currently allocated. Doing the work, as has already been mentioned, so the sequential tests which were run, this would ensure that the sites at lower risk of flooding would be allocated. And at this moment, we don't have that overview of knowing if that would make a significant impact or not on the local plan and which sites would be allocated. And then separately, if any sites after that were required in an area of flood risk, we don't know if they can be delivered without increasing flood risk or putting people and property at risk of flooding. This is largely to do with the allocated sites as they are the change in climate change. So at the moment, the sequential exception test uses flood zone 2 as a proxy and does not use the relevant climate change allowances that are specific for the use of a site, but these climate change extents are now available and should be used within an exception test. So yeah, in general, there has been a change in flood risk on some allocated sites.
Before because otherwise I'll forget, you mentioned the climate change extents for the exception test. Is that only relevant on sites requiring the exception test? Or is that?
I believe so. And the sequential test, you would use the flood map for planning, which doesn't include climate change extents.
Thank you. Sorry, carry on. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, there have been some increases in flood risk on some of the allocated sites. So one of our major concerns at the moment is the amount of development allocated on those sites cannot be delivered without having a flood risk implication. So whether that's increasing flood risk, putting people and property at risk of flooding, or if there's safe access and egress, primarily. Just like to mention that the Windsor and Maidenhead committed to updating their evidence base when the new model was published, in both the October statement of common ground between ourselves and the borough, and in the new sequential exception test that was done in October 2019. And we do acknowledge the timing is unfortunate, and we might be happy with an alternative measure similar to what the council suggested, as long as it captures those flood risk concerns so that the sites are deliverable without impacting on flood risk, and preferably that there's confidence that these allocated sites are at the lowest risk of flooding.
So just taking that point a bit further then, because that's obviously very interesting. If you might be happy with an alternative approach to rerunning the whole lot, what are the sort of main components that you'd want to see them taking account of in that? So if they were to just look at the sites, which is what Mr. Beard was proposing they were going to do, what would they need to do for the sites that are proposed to be allocated to satisfy you that they've done enough, albeit that you'll still come from the point that that's not perfect, but what would they need to do as a minimum?
I guess in essence, it would need to pass the exception test and all the things that are captured within that, so that the development is demonstrated to be safe for its lifetime. So that includes climate change, includes safe access and egress, and it doesn't increase flood risk elsewhere. And I guess captures any site-specific issues that would arise. But that would essentially be like doing the exception test. And just to make clear that ideally, the sequential test would be rerun if you deem that appropriate.
Thank you. And if I could just ask you the same question that I asked the council about taking that sort of secondary and less ideal approach. If we could be satisfied that the sites that are proposed to be allocated are capable of delivery in a safe way, what's the risk that we would potentially miss some sites, not going searching for different ones again, but of the sites that were excluded because they weren't perhaps in flood zone 1 near the top of the exception test? From your experience and knowledge of what the model does, is it likely that we would suddenly find from the sites already considered that there were a bunch that were excluded because they were at high flood risk that are now all of a sudden at very low flood risk because of changes in the assumption of the model? Or is that not likely?
I think it's unlikely that there would be a really big change in the amount of sites or which sites would be allocated. I'm aware of a flood risk change in Datchet, where they were previously shown at higher flood risk, but that is being captured with groundwater flooding rather than fluvial flooding. So that should also really be considered in the sequential test.
Thank you. So back to the council just briefly before I know Miss Elsa's got her hand up, and then I will come on to others. You heard what Miss Sanderson thinks you would need to do as a minimum for any alternative to be considered acceptable at all by the Environment Agency. It seemed to relate mainly to the exception test. So demonstrating that sites could pass the exception test, including with this allowance for climate change, safe access and egress, and not increasing flood risk elsewhere. Can you come back, council, and just confirm that it's your intention, or if it wasn't your intention, that could be done for those sites, so that you would apply the current up-to-date data, including for climate change, to the allocated sites?
Madam, that's precisely what we had in mind, and it's very helpful. Thank you to the Environment Agency to clarify that. We can provide that. We can undertake that work and provide you with that information in a note.
Thank you. Thank you. So if everybody else now who wants to speak on this matter relating to the use of the model, I'll take the sort of clause 2 and exception test bullet points separately. But if anyone now who wants to speak relating to the use of the model, could you put up your hand now? Because I'm only going to probably hear from you each once, and so I'd like you to say everything that you want to say. If you can all put your hands up now, so I know how much time I'm likely to need, that would be helpful. Okay, so I've got 2 hands up. So if anyone else who wants to speak, please put your hands up.
Ma'am,
now.
sorry, can I unmute? It's Mary Cook here. Can I just indicate I would like to speak?
But you can't put your Mary Cook. Okay, I'll in fact then should we hear, let's hear from you now. If you haven't got your, then I won't forget you. So let's hear from Cook now. If you turn your video on as well, please.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you.
And bearing in mind that the points that you have indicated, what I just wanted to say was this. So I sit here representing IM Land, interested in AL25 and AL28. And as we indicated in our answers to your matter statement, we have looked at the new material so far as AL25 is concerned, and we find that the proportion of land in flood zone 1 and flood zone 2 in AL25 has changed, but fundamentally the site is still in flood zone 1 and 2, and so the conclusions of the sequential test which the council have undertaken remain valid. I appreciate that that's a point that goes to my site alone, and you are looking at things on a wider basis. But I think that also is a piece of evidence that you could have regard to when you are contemplating the answers to the questions you've asked both the council and the Environment Agency about the level of risk. And certainly we wouldn't in any way be shy about or concerned about the results of any exercise that the council have indicated that they would be prepared to do. Another point that I just want to raise now is, particularly in light of the EA referencing the sequential, referencing in particular, sorry, the exception test. I just want to draw attention to the fact that my understanding of the broad position is that the sites that are allocated, which encompass flood zone 1 and flood zone 2, and even sites which include a little bit of flood zone 3, and I'm not here distinguishing between 3A or 3B. My understanding is that the allocations in relation to those sites envisage development only on flood zone 1 and flood zone 2, and not in fact in flood zone 3. And one of the things that struck me when I was looking at NR1 is, why isn't there an explicit statement in NR1 which excludes development and from flood zone 3? Because if there were such a statement, wouldn't that, in respect of the allocated sites, put compliance with the sequential test beyond doubt? And wouldn't that go a large way to meeting the concerns of the Environment Agency in respect of the exception test? Because after all, promoting, as the council is, land for development, which is in the more vulnerable classification in flood zone 2, doesn't actually give rise to the exception test.
Okay.
By reference to table 3. So that is just a practical and I think a reasonably pragmatic suggestion that perhaps could be considered in the rewording of NR1, which will help to demonstrate compliance with the sequential test. Because as you will have gathered from our representations, we are looking to avoid a situation where we're allocated in accordance with a sequential test, and then we have to revisit that at a planning application stage. Okay. So I think that's really the main thrust of what I wanted to say. And thank you very much for taking me out of time as a result of my own ineptitude. I promise to get better.
No problem, thank you. Okay, Mr. Els.
Good morning, Inspector. As you know, I act on behalf of European Property Ventures, and we had a lot of discussions about flood risk at the first hearings, which we participated in. But today, I specifically want to make the case that we agree with the Environment Agency that the plan isn't based on the most up-to-date flood model, and it really needs to be updated to be able to be sound and to be reliant. As you will recall, we have been promoting sites north of Churchmead School, HA41 at Datchet, which has been discounted now through the proposed changes. However, through the latest information available from the Thames model, our information and modelling undertaken by WSP has demonstrated that the site becomes preferable or has a better scenario in terms of the flood risk assessed that discounted the site. From reference to the Environment Agency's discussion earlier, we are confident that the site would again be able to pass the exception test in terms of access, egress, and causing no increased risk of flooding elsewhere. Therefore, we believe that the flood model data from the Thames model has to be reused and has to be reassessed for all of the discounted sites as well. Because currently the reason that development at Datchet is not proceeding as originally intended is based upon inaccurate information regarding groundwater and now surface water flooding as well. We believe that use of the Lower Thames model would be able to demonstrate that the site north of Churchmead School is acceptable for development and can be brought forward for a mixed-use development in accordance with national guidance. For the plan to be based upon reliable information, they have to use the Lower Thames model and they have to reassess all of the sites that they've discounted. Now, I know that this may take some time, but the council's already taken quite a lot of time in getting to the position today. And I think the most...
Sorry, just to be a little, I know so it shouldn't be site specific, but do you have to hand, because you said that it performed better. So what, for example, does it show as the percentage in flood zone 1?
So the percentage in flood zone 1 is increased towards the residential areas. I think the details of that are produced in the WSP statements that are with my examination hearing statement and is illustrated through the mapping provided. More specifically though, the mapping does demonstrate that the climate change factors don't relate to the majority of the site suddenly becoming flood zone 3, which was the key reasoning for the discounting of the site and questioning of the site during the first examination hearings. Okay. Using the most up-to-date information, we can demonstrate for the Datchet site that climate change does not have the damning effect that was identified during the first examination hearings, and that in terms of delivering employment and residential alongside local infrastructure, this site can be brought forward, prioritising flood zone 1 areas for housing and using flood zone 2 areas for employment.
Okay, thank you. I have a question for the council in terms of those sites, the discounted sites perhaps. Okay. So I'll come to that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Madam. I'll try and keep this sort of fairly general, but obviously our comments do relate to HA24 and the Summerley site. And I think that there is another angle here, perhaps, that there are a number of sites that are allocated in the submission version of the plan. And I think some of the conversation I've had this morning is quite interesting in how that could impact on that. Definitely have huge sympathy for the council in having to bring the plan forward with so many delays to that information, but we do now have that. And I think there is perhaps a pragmatic, is a word we've heard already, and it seems that people are trying to find a way towards a pragmatic solution. previously in the stage 1 examination, we talked quite a lot about we ran into difficulties at the second part of the exceptions test and the need for a sort of a detailed assessment. The latest model information does remove that uncertainty. It gives, as we've heard, the latest climate change factors. It's a full model. It does allow assessments, detailed assessments, and a lot of us will have carried those out. We have as well through our consultants, to show that if a specific site can come forward and meet the exceptions test, then we feel very strongly that we should still look to some of those originally submitted sites where they can still make a contribution for other reasons, such as A24.
I know you've been here. I've just had a look. I made myself, and I made myself a useful little document, just summarising some of the things that about the sites that were proposed to be deleted. And I mean, my note says about HA24.
Yeah.
For example, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. This is from the first model, obviously, or what was found in the sequential, or what the council said about it. That 0% of the site was in flood zone 1 and 47% in flood zone 3A. So sort of being a little bit specific, if you want to be site specific. Yeah. I mean, even if you can demonstrate that it can pass the exception test, which you possibly can, I mean, should we be doing that if it's got no land in flood zone 1 and if they've found sufficient sites that have got land in flood zone 1? Because I think it's more of a sequential test result rather than a exception test result, doesn't it?
Well, it did pass the sequential test initially, done as part of the
not in the rerun.
No, but I think that part of what you said is they are two sides to this.
Okay.
Does the council have sufficient land to meet its housing needs? And we talked about that earlier this week in terms of whether there's sufficient sites to provide family housing, and that's again come back to that another time. But we feel very much that they can't, and so should you set aside a site which has previously been considered acceptable for housing, can provide family housing, has gone through the various sieves of analysis, whether that be green belt, sequential testing, all the documents that draw those conclusions, should that be set aside? I can understand the uncertainty that existed at the time, and the absence of information. It makes life very, very difficult. We have now got that information. So if there is the comfort that sites can pass the exceptions test and make a sustainable contribution to meeting housing need, I think it would be, well, obviously I would say that, but I think it would be a terrible mistake to set those sites aside.
Yeah.
And they are on the table, they have been tested, they have been assessed against other criteria. And if this is the last stumbling block to sites such as that coming forward, and it can be removed. And I think that the approach that the council are taking and the EA are taking now and looking at sites, that you do that, we seem to be moving towards a detailed FRA, effectively, exceptions test for each site. Then these sites can make as much of a contribution to those, if not more, in some cases.
Thank you.
I may have comments on the other points, but I think you indicated that we deal with those separately for safe escapements.
Yeah, we will, and you'll be able to come back on those. So thank you. That's helpful. And finally, Mr. Bond, before I then want to just come back to the council.
Thank you, ma'am. As you know, my interests in this session relate to the Triangle site, which is a employment site, not a residential site. Number of points that I think it's fair for you to note and hopefully provide comfort. Firstly, industrial uses are a less vulnerable use. And as a result of that, that is clearly different to a residential use, being far less sensitive. And furthermore, as confirmed in table 3, no exceptions test is required for those less vulnerable uses in zones 1, 2, and 3A. The next point to note is, and we'll come on to later in the examination, the level of need that the council have identified, and that having to be met. It is very clear that the sequential test in respect of those industrial uses has been passed, because simply there is only one site that has been identified, that being the triangle site, such that whichever model is used, and I'll come back to that in a second, the sequential test is still passed. The council's assessment to date has been based on the 2009 Thames model, which identifies the whole 25 hectares in flood zones 1, 2 and 3A. But you will note from our evidence to this examination that we have taken on board the 2020 Lower Thames model and the CUT model, which was released in April 2020, albeit taking into account climate change. And using those more up-to-date models, 20 hectares of the 25 hectares lies within zones 1, 2 and 3A. 5 hectares, which we are not relying upon, lie in 3B. And it's that those areas within zones 1, 2 and 3A are more than sufficient to meet the identified needs for industrial uses identified by the council, and that's even adopting quite conservative density ratios. So as a result, I hope some comfort can be taken in relation to the employment strategy of the plan, that there will be no implications whatsoever with the use of the more up-to-date modelling in relation to the council being able to deliver and meet the industrial uses that they have identified. So I hope that provides some comfort, and I'm hoping, obviously not prejudging, that the note that the council will prepare that they've alluded to, I presume that's in relation primarily to the residential sites, will also include the triangle site too, confirming
Thank you.
that indeed it is deliverable and the yield, the appropriate level of yield is sufficient to meet the identified needs.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bond. Okay, just coming back to the council with 2 questions arising out of that. I'll hear from the council, and the Environment Agency, of course, can comment as well if they want to say anything before we move on to the other couple of flood risk matters. The first one is a simple one, is can you just confirm that in your proposed reassessment of the allocated sites, you would reassess the employment sites as well as the housing sites? And the second, from listening to Ms. Else and Mr. Scott, is there a case when you rerun the sort of test for the allocated sites? Is there a case for perhaps doing the same thing for those sites proposed to be deleted from the submission version of the plan for flood risk grounds? I'm not sure how much additional work that would add. I've had a quick, that's why I'm looking at my other screen counting up. So I did make myself, as I said, this helpful little table, and I thought there might be about 11 sites. Mr. Beard, can't hear you.
Sorry, I beg your pardon, madam. I was just saying something to my team. In response to your first question, we can certainly confirm that our note will cover both employment allocations as well as housing allocations, and we're grateful to Mr. Bond for his contribution during this hearing. Madam, in respect of your second question, I hesitate because, to be very frank, we don't know sitting here exactly what level of work or the time it would take to undertake the type of further testing, etc., that would be necessary to provide you with an adequate and helpful response on that. Might we have a short period of time just to consider our position on that and respond to you very, very quickly as to whether or not that's feasible? The only thing I would say is, insofar as it might involve the need for wider amount of work to do, what I mean by that is something edging towards full sequential testing, for example. Might I just make absolutely clear that our firm position, as Councillor Coppinger made clear in his opening statement, is that this plan must be adopted and must be adopted as soon as humanly possible. And to the extent that there may be merit in what either Ms. Els or Mr. Scott says, we have to be alive to the reality that the purpose of the note that we're providing you is to satisfy you that this plan is sound and that you can have confidence that it is deliverable in that respect. Insofar as that proves over time not to be the case, this plan must be reviewed, and it must be reviewed in any event within 5 years. So.
I appreciate that, and I think that's fine. The reason I raised that question, and I don't know that in considering your answer and whether you think you can do something for me, I don't necessarily think that you need to go into perhaps the same level of detail as you do for the sites that are going to remain allocated, because as you say, if we got to the end of the whole examination and we found you couldn't meet the housing requirements, then that's the point at which you then need to consider whether some more which can pass the exception test should be put in, rather than now when your position is that it can. I'm thinking more just from the point of view that clearly there are people who are unhappy that their site, and it is proposed to be allocated in the submission version of the plan. If there's any possibility that the model would show that that's why I keep asking the question, would it suddenly show that something was in flood zone 1 and you've actually discounted it for a flood risk reason when it's no longer going to flood? I think that's going to give you problems later on. And I mean, I've had a little look down my list, and as I was saying, I'm not sure, some of these sites were 0% in flood zone 1 anyway, or 1% in flood zone 1. So it's quite possible that they'll now, that won't have changed. But all of a sudden, if you flick one up and it was 80% in flood zone 1, then you might say, well, actually it passes the sequential test. So it's that sort of level that I was thinking about, rather than the detailed, could it deliver and what could it deliver? I agree with you that that's probably a point for a later date.
That's very helpful indeed. We will certainly, we're alive to all of those issues, and also the need and the reality that you're examining the the submission version of the plan, and have to be satisfied that main modifications are necessary. So we're alive to that as well. We will give that some early consideration and confirm, as I say very quickly, that our note will cover that, whether or not our note will cover that, and if not, why.
Okay, thank you. Anything further from the Environment Agency? And then I'm going to move the discussion on. I know, Ms. Els, you've got your hand up. You might be able to make your point under the next 2 bullet points. So I'm conscious of time. Did the Environment Agency want to say anything more before I move on?
Just coming back on Mr. Bond's comment on AL14, which I believe we're covering this under a different matter, that we have concerns about the site's deliverability. And just to say that the cut model was actually released in 2013, not April 2020. But otherwise, I think you've covered our points on.
You won't have seen it yet, but on the employment allocations agenda, I think it's matter 4. There'll be time to discuss the details of that site. So thank you.
Okay. Yeah, and I think you raised our comments on the sequential test issue if other sites, excuse me, are allocated or are proposed instead.
Thank you. Okay, so turning over on the agenda then, I've asked about clause 2. So I've now got too many things open on my screen. What to do with them all? Okay. Clause 2. Okay, so clause 2. Clarification that the sequential test for allocated sites was satisfied at the plan making stage. Now, the council, I think, accepts in its statement that clause 2 should be amended in accordance with paragraph 104 of the MPPF to clarify that the sequential test was satisfied at the plan making stage for allocated sites. But I think my understanding from the EA's comments was that you don't agree that a change is necessary. I mean, I'm coming from what I personally think it would be helpful for development management purposes to clarify that in clause 2, but I'd be interested if the EA wants to just put their position as to why they don't think that would be helpful. Perhaps if the EA goes first, and then I'll hear from the council.
So we did not think this would be helpful, as not all sites have passed the sequential test, so it wouldn't be accurate to have that in the policy. Did you want me to go into detail now about why we don't think the sequential test has been passed.
This was for clarifying that allocated sites had passed the sequential test, because presumably they must have done to be allocated in the plan. So it was just not for windfall sites or whatever, but just the proposal was to clarify that the sequential test for allocated sites had been passed at the plan making stage.
Yeah, so we don't believe, well, the sequential test has not been satisfied for all of the allocated sites within the local plan. Our main concern on that was AL13, which was not subject to the sequential test.
Right.
And it hasn't been passed using the latest available evidence, as the Lower Thames model and the up-to-date flood map planning have not been used.
Okay. So you may have obviously specific concerns on AL13. We could turn back to that. If I ended up going with
Sorry, AL15.
AL15.
Braywick Park.
Sorry. But is there a more general concern that the other sites can't be deemed to have passed it because if the up-to-date mapping has not been used?
Yes, they haven't passed the sequential test using the latest available evidence.
So then if we were to go back to where we're sort of almost coming to, perhaps, that some more detailed work, and you said you could maybe live with that. If we went down that route of only reassessing the proposed allocated sites rather than rerunning the whole test, would the Environment Agency, even if you'd signed up to that approach, would you then be insisting at the planning application stage that they will pass the sequential test again? Because that might be being pragmatic now and then just leaving the difficulty to a later date, which doesn't seem very helpful.
I guess our position is now we would want the sequential test to be redone to ensure that the plan is justified. But if you don't deem that appropriate, then we would be happy to look at alternative measures.
Okay.
And then we would be concerned with that wording in that policy, as it wouldn't be true.
Thank you. Okay. Would the council like to respond on that?
Madam, we're just not entirely clear what you want a response on. We note that AL15 relates to an allocation that is a mixed-use strategic green infrastructure site to serve Maidenhead, and it comprises of a sports hub, public park, special needs school, and multi-use games area and wildlife zone. We're not entirely clear what it is that the Environment Agency considers would be achieved by carrying out sequential testing at this stage. So perhaps
I'll ask them for that. Sorry, I'd forgotten that point, to be honest. It was more about,
I beg your pardon.
it was more about if we go down the route of only in sort of testing in detail the allocated sites through the new data. I think what the EA was saying was that they would still then consider that they hadn't passed the sequential test, and you'd have to, because you hadn't used the up-to-date modelling, to do the whole lot of sequential test, which would then seem to almost defeat the object if you'd have to then do it again at the planning application stage.
We simply don't accept that. Our position, as I mentioned in opening, is that this plan has been subject to adequate and appropriate sequential testing that complies with national policy based upon the best information that was available at the time. Now, I simply don't accept that if the agency is saying that flood mapping information that was published online or the like became available through the process of through the course of 2019 is the basis upon which they say the sequential testing is not adequate or appropriate. I don't accept that at all. It was agreed between the agency and ourselves back in 2018, a statement of common ground that that included work that was going to be that was set out in detail, that Madam, of course, you were aware of and approved. Dare I say, it simply doesn't lie within the agency's mouth now to say that, almost 2 years later, that the work has been done is not acceptable. We firmly resist the position the agency is progressing.
Thank you. Final point there on that to the Environment Agency then, given the point that Mr. Beard has just made. If a new model came out the day after, forgetting what's gone by, this is just an in principle, if a new model came out the day after the plan was adopted and the policy said that the sites allocated had been deemed to pass the sequential tests at the allocated stage, and then a new model comes out the day after, would you then be saying that this was the sequential test hadn't been passed, it was untrue? Or is it only because it's available now before it's adopted?
I think there are a few points there. So the flood map for planning was updated in 2019 before the sequential or during the sequential exception test document creation. So it was available data during or presumably before that document was made. So the document was not made on the best available data at that time. As one thing to consider. Our main concern that the statement won't be accurate is because the site, well, 3 sites have not been subject to the sequential test. So they haven't passed the sequential test, including AL15, that includes more and less vulnerable uses. Therefore, it really is essential, and it is in an area of high flood risk partially. The sequential test should be applied to that site. And then on introducing new modelling, of course, if the plan is adopted, the sequential test is passed at the time when the plan was being made, but it's tricky now in the sense that the model is out and the plan is not adopted, and data has been available during the creation of these documents that wasn't used.
Thank you. Okay, Ms. Els.
Thank you. Sorry, I couldn't find my mouse then. Yes, we agree entirely with the Environment Agency's point, and that the sequential test is failed by not using the most up-to-date data. This data has been available, and we have been using this data for a considerable amount of time to promote the site at Datchet to the local residents and through the neighbourhood plan, demonstrating that the flood risk has actually been reduced on sites and that the site is developable. From the previous session, what I was going to say is that because WSP have modelled the site for my client, that information can be made available quite easily to the WSP team that is acting on behalf of the council. So in terms of demonstrating the suitability or preferable flood risk nature using the Thames model, that wouldn't take any time at all. So that isn't really a limiting factor for reconsideration of the site at Datchet. In relation to the sequential test, one other point that I'd really like to make is the fact that the new flood model data that should be informed through this new sequential test does adequately take account of climate change, and this is an important factor when considering the local plan and future allocations. And I think basing a sequential test on old flood risk data that doesn't take that into account just makes the whole evidence base unsound and makes the proposals, the new allocations that are being proposed by the council unsound. So realistically, I don't think there's a case to not undertake that sequential test again using the most up-to-date data as the Environment Agency have robustly set out.
Thank you. Okay, final point from Ms. Cook, please, and then we'll move on to the bullet on the exception test. Ms. Cook.
Thank you, Ma'am. I just wanted to come back on a point that the Environment Agency just raised in answer to your question, when they mentioned that there were 3 sites that were not subjected to the sequential test, and therefore for that reason they would still not agree with the statement, if you were to put it into NR1, that allocated sites had been subject to the sequential test. Those 3 sites, as I understand it, are AL15, AL27 and AL28. I in particular am interested in AL28. And actually, I think in particular of those 3, the one that they are principally concerned with is AL15. These are all sites which are identified for green infrastructure, but they point in relation to AL15 to mention of built development in the form of a new leisure centre. What I just wanted to draw to your attention was the notes to table 3 in the planning practice guidance, which say that the sequential test and exception tests don't need to be applied to changes of use. And it was my understanding, or it is my understanding, that the council didn't subject AL28, my site, my green infrastructure site, to any sequential testing, because actually they took the view that to go from a green field to green infrastructure was simply a change of use. So I just wanted to draw your attention to that point. Not sure it's necessarily terribly helpful, because what I understand the question that you were driving at, but the answer that you were given relates to a slightly separate point, which is the need for sequential testing on green infrastructure sites.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps I could ask the Environment Agency to comment on that later, but I'm conscious I need to move the agenda on as well. So maybe when the Environment Agency next speaks, they could comment on that. But I now want to just move on to this point about whether there's a need in the policy for a specific clause on the exception test and a requirement for safe access and egress to be achieved. So my question is, does policy NR1 make any reference directly or indirectly to the exception test? And if it doesn't, should it? And I know that there's been points made about it being in national policy, so there's no need to put it in here, but the sequential test is referenced, notwithstanding there it is in national policy. So my question is, why not the exception test? And I think with the support of the EA, the council has suggested adding the requirement for safe access and egress to be demonstrated at the development management stage to clause 6E. And I don't object to that, but it's not clear to me that the rest of this clause actually concerns the exception test. And my question is, would it not be clearer to have a separate clause on the exception test and to clarify that it applies to allocated and non-allocated sites? So perhaps if the council could answer first.
Thank you, Madam. I'll run briefly through those various questions, and I'll pick up on obviously on that point about safe access and egress in particular. But first of all, yeah, I mean, first of all, I'd like to also thank you for the very, very helpful comments. So in terms of clause 2, as explained in the council's response to matter 8 issue 1 question 3.
We're talk about the exception test now.
Oh, okay. So the exception test. So yes, we state in our response that both elements will need to be passed, and we do not consider that any further changes to NR1 are necessary. Both the council and the agency agree that both elements should be satisfied. Whilst the council does not believe changes are necessary, if you do consider that a clarification is necessary for soundness, then the council would not be averse to that. In regard to safe access and egress, Our response is that we agree that a safe access and egress route should be provided at the this is one of the requirements to be investigated at the planning application stage. At the plan making stage, sites which pass the sequential test show the potential availability of safe access and egress. Yes, we did indicate that we felt that an amendment to clause 6E would be appropriate, but having just heard what you said, we would not be averse to a standalone separate clause on that safe access.
I think, and just being slightly awkward, but I think you've got a requirement about the sequential test. I think given that it is obviously an issue that's been quite significant in this plan, I think it would be helpful to have, I'm not saying exactly what it should be. I think personally there should be a clause in there on the exception test. Yes. Unless anyone else now wants to put their hand up and disagree with me, perhaps I could ask the council to consider some wording for that. Mr. Scott.
When you put your hand up and then you finish your sentence by say disagreeing with you, I kind of wished I hadn't, but I wasn't going to disagree. I was just going to simply point. I was simply going to point out that the wording of paragraph 163 doesn't actually insist on safe access as in terms of escape routes. It says where appropriate, and I think from some of the submissions we've made where we've provided an evacuation plan. It's a principle that was accepted in the level 1 SFRA way back and has been accepted on various sites, certainly ones that I've worked on over the years in the borough, where because of the nature of the flood events, which unfold over at least a number of days, there's plenty of opportunity to put in place evacuation plans. And I think in a lot of occasions, it would be more appropriate to have an evacuation plan rather than to encourage a sense of last minute exiting when you've got a number of days to prepare for it. I think that, so I would simply ask that the wording of that clause, which I agree ought to be in there in terms of an exceptions test, reflects the wording of the NPPF and includes the phrase where appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you. Sanderson.
So firstly, we would support the inclusion of the clause on the exception test and would be happy to work with the council on a new clause on that. And yes, there is a requirement for safe access and egress for the lifetime of development to be achieved in order for the exception test to be passed. We just wanted to raise that safe access and egress goes further than just for the exception test. So I can provide an example. So less vulnerable development, so maybe a shop, a restaurant or an office that's in flood zone 3 is not subject to the exception test in according with planning practice guidance, but safe access and egress is clearly required so that people would be able to leave those buildings in the event of a flood safely. Therefore, we do feel the need for a specific clause on safe access and egress in part 6E of NR1 that specifically refers to safe access and egress, and for that to be wider than just for the sequential exception test, so it to be a standalone part of the policy.
Thank you, that's helpful. Okay, so I think where we are with that is that the modification that you proposed to clause 6E still stands for the reasons that Ms. Sanderson has just outlined. And if I could ask you to get together with the EA to consider a clause on the exception test, I think that would be helpful. It's 12:15. I think, to be honest, I'm hoping that covers the bulk of our agenda. There are a couple of other small issues on flooding, which I'm hoping are going to be fairly small, and then some other reasonably small points, I think, on the other policies. So I propose now to take a break for 15 minutes until 12:15. Until 12:30, and then we'll come back to finish that agenda. So we'll adjourn at 12:15 until 12:30. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Welcome back, everyone. It's 12:30 now, so the hearing is resumed. Just a couple of points to finish on the other issues on flooding before we move on. Having dutifully read the paragraph I've referred to, 12.2.5, during the break, I now don't know what I was referring to, really. It's something to do with increased flood risk in Datchet. I think I must have got the wrong paragraph reference. I don't know whether anyone can help me with that. Ms. Els.
Hi. Well, I was going to actually support the point that you raised, which is
I've got the right paragraph.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
It's really that the paragraph needs to be amended to remove the reference to groundwater flooding at Datchet. This isn't evidence, and there's no reasoning for that to be specifically identified. The council and the Environment Agency have both accepted that in their statements, so we are really just supporting the proposed revision. However,
where does it say groundwater flooding in Datchet in paragraph 12.2.5?
Is it 1.5?
Because it begins to help reduce flood risk. I just don't think I've got the right paragraph. Yeah, Miss Valley.
Yeah, if I may, I just wanted to say that you should read paragraph 12.2.15, and I've got a few comments when it's my turn.
12.2.15. There we go.
So I even wrote it down wrong, Inspector, after looking at your comments.
Makes sense now.
Yeah, obviously we support the change, but we would just really like to bring your attention to the fact that this is another factual inaccuracy regarding Datchet and my client's site there. Really, this is a further misrepresentation of flood risk, which contributed to the site's removal from the plan. Obviously, the Lower Thames flood modelling will improve the site's surface water flood risk and fluvial flood risk. The groundwater flood risk has fallen away. And so really it just helps to demonstrate that our site needs to be reconsidered again, because it's quite evident that the information the council has used is incorrect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Miss Valley, but I think the point is that the sentence in red is proposed to be removed, which I think is what the Environment Agency was saying. Is that right? Is there anything more to say on it, Miss Valley?
Yes, we would not object to the removal of the reference, as it is misleading in a context of climate change. However, the latest flood risk evidence has helped us refine our understanding of flood risk in this area, mainly in terms of the influence of groundwater flooding, which we believe that the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead are committed in reviewing. If you, Madam the Inspector, are satisfied that the flood risk evidence base for the local plan should be updated to reflect the new evidence so that the plan is justified and ensure it is effective, then references to updated flood risk information in relation to groundwater flood risk in Datchet should be addressed in the local plan. This would ensure that developers and communities are aware of the risk.
Thank you. Does the council wish to say anything about that point?
Sorry, just trying to get my video the video to start. First of all, yes, we accept, as we've said, that the position of that sentence is unhelpful within the climate change section, misleading, and we also, as we've said, we wouldn't resist a deletion of the sentence if it's necessary for soundness. But I mean, coming back to that point that was just made about whether some sort of alternative text needs to be inserted. I mean, obviously, I'd have to take. We'd have to discuss that and give that further consideration. But I mean, but again, it comes back to the same point that this is very, very recent evidence, and that it's really sort of come too late. So I think we probably think that it's probably better not to include that.
Okay. Well, for a start, let's just not. I think it's not removing anything. It's just not adding that sentence.
Yeah. Absolutely, we would agree with that.
Okay, moving on then to clause 8 concerning the buffers to watercourses. Policy NR1 now. I think clause 8 is proposed to be added in response to representations made by the EA, and they've explained that the requirement for an 8-metre buffer only applies to main rivers, but that it's good practice for other watercourses. So I don't know if anyone can remind me of who, if anyone, was seeking flexibility to reduce the size of the buffer depending on the type of watercourse. I know that I have read that, so perhaps you could remind me of that. But then as a suggestion, I wondered whether, unless it's necessary, rather than potentially weakening that addition by suggesting that the buffer could be reduced in the policy, maybe the supporting text could explain the circumstances in which a smaller buffer might be appropriate. So maybe if I could turn to the council on that.
Yes, thank you, Madam. Yes, we would acknowledge that a reference in the supporting text would be appropriate, and that could, for example, include. We'd need to give this more thought, but it could include issues around the size and nature of the watercourse, location, ecological value. But certainly, we would be not averse to some additional text in the supporting text.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else wish to speak on this matter? And particularly if you disagree with what I've just suggested. I know, so let's start with Miss Sanderson, then I'll hear from Miss Valley and Mr. Scott.
Just want to highlight that the 8-metre buffer zone is a minimum requirement on main rivers. So if there is supporting text, we would seek for this to explicitly state that on a main river, 8-metre is always a minimum.
Okay, thank you. Yep. Miss Valley, did you want to add anything?
I think it would just be to clarify that that 8-metre buffer zone is required for maintenance purposes, and also to be able to put up any flood defences measures should there be any required in future.
Thank you. If you could put your hands down when you've spoken, unless you're still wanting to say something more. Just notice those are still up. Thank you, Miss Valley. Mr. Scott.
Thank you. Just a very small point. The scope of what that clause should cover. The developments in Maidenhead Town Centre would all have been alongside the York Stream, all breach the 8-metre buffer zone. There are still development sites alongside the York Stream. So just the council, glad they're sort of going to add that additional clause into the text, but perhaps that would just be one of the other areas they consider in drafting that. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps Mr. Mottrell, if you could just comment on that last point raised by Mr. Scott. You're not adding something that's impossible to comply with, but presumably if it's required by the Environment Agency, you should be doing that anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. But just to one point, I mean, we need to double check this, but we're not 100% sure that we think that the York Stream is probably not classed as a main river, but we'd need to double check that. And as such, that would explain perhaps why 8 metres may not have been considered to be appropriate as an ecological buffer. But we would, as I say, need to double check that.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. And finally, on flooding, I don't want to discuss this for too long. I mean, obviously, I think Mr. Hill raised yesterday the problems about the River Thames scheme. Now, I'd asked whether flood relief measures needed to be identified on the policies map, if anything needed to be safeguarded for the River Thames scheme. But I think we left it in a previous session that a note was to be prepared in respect of the council's current position on that, because I think things have moved on. But would it follow from our discussion that if the council isn't now a part of that scheme, you're not going to be wanting to safeguard any land in your plan?
We'd need to give that more thought. I mean, we did suggest that we we were thinking about suggesting that the safeguarding maybe should be maintained for that route channel 1 in case funding is subsequently identified or secured for the scheme. Therefore, there would be a possibility that it could be delivered, later in the plan period. We do note that the agency did not object to that continued safeguarding, but we would not absolutely insist on that. We'd take your lead on that, Madam.
Well, perhaps you could think about that
Yeah,
and
yeah.
cover it as part of that note.
Yeah, we will. We'll do that.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we'll leave flooding there. Mr. Bond, a last point.
If I may, ma'am, I've deliberately left this to the end because I didn't want to disturb the flow of your agenda. Could I just tidy up one very small loose end for your note in response to Helen Sanderson's comment about my reference to the CUP model being 2020. She is right that the CUP model is dated 2013. However, we have used the EA product 4 data, which lies behind that model, which was supplied by the EA in April 2020, which is why I made reference to that date. And that's a matter that I've also made clear in my matter 4 statement at paragraph 17. So I just wanted to ensure that the data that we have used to support the figures for the triangle site are indeed the correct and most up-to-date ones.
Thank you. Okay, I'm not going to come back to that now.
No. Just want to clarify that point. Thank you.
We'll discuss that again probably under matter 4, but thank you for that.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, so moving on now to policy NR2, nature conservation and biodiversity. Find it. There we are. Nature conservation and biodiversity. So I just have a few small questions, I think, here, but then anyone wishing to say anything further can obviously do so. So if I could perhaps cover my points, and then we can hear from anyone else wishing to speak. So clause 1, I think the council and other respondents agree that clause 1 should refer to protected habitats as well as protected species. So I'll take that as agreed, unless anyone puts their hand up. Ms. Hure.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Yes, we welcome that particular improvement, but would also add that the revised wording also talks about only avoiding harm and loss, but objective 1 requires that biodiversity is both enhanced and protected. So we think avoiding harm and loss is not sufficient. It also ought to talk about enhancement.
And where is the requirement for enhancement coming?
From objective 1 of the plan.
Okay. Ms. Luttrell, Mr. Gillespie, should it also?
Yeah, well, okay. We'd have to clearly look at that further. I am aware, obviously, that of the sort of requirements coming up through the Environment Bill for the biodiversity net gain, but clearly that's something that is still to be finalised, I believe. But we can certainly give that some further consideration as to whether that needs to be amended to refer to improvements as well as harm and or loss.
Okay. Thank you. Anything else on clause 1 from anybody?
Well, I think as you've already said, Madam, we have agreed to the other amendment about habitats. So that's
okay.
all to say on that.
The main modification to add reference to protected habitats, and perhaps if you could give some thoughts to whether it should also refer to enhancement, and perhaps it could, unless there's any specific reason why it shouldn't, if we leave it that way.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you, Madam.
Clause 2C. So I've said here, the council has explained that clause 2C, which refers to sites of local importance, is intended to protect local wildlife sites. And in response to Regulation 20 representations, the council proposes to make this explicit in the clause, especially because the sites are shown on the policies map, and I think that would be helpful. The council's also explained that clause 2C is intended to apply to local nature reserves. So I'm just asking really for completeness, should this be clarified in the same way? And I have a question as to whether the local nature reserves are shown on the map.
Yes, I have had an opportunity to consider this point further and discuss it with our ecologist, and we would agree that for clarity, the council would not be averse to an amendment to include an explicit reference to local nature reserves as well as to local wildlife sites. There are not that many. There are about 8 or so local nature reserves in the borough, and they can all be quite easily mapped as well. So that'd be fine.
Okay, so a modification there to refer to local wildlife sites and LNRs. Thank you.
Yes.
Sure.
Thank you, ma'am. Wild Maidenhead absolutely applauds and supports the inclusion of local wildlife sites and local nature reserves here. But I also wanted to alert you to the lack of monitoring of the quality of local wildlife sites and other habitats over periods relevant to ecological interests. So in the incoming Environment Bill, and perhaps therefore to future-proof this plan to the Environment Bill, it ought to refer to a timescale of 30 years to ensure that any impacts are monitored over a period of 30 years.
I think we left it, didn't we, on day one, that you were going to discuss the biodiversity indicators. Is that right, with the council?
That's right. Yes, Mr. Gillespie very kindly offered us a meeting with him, so we could add this to that meeting.
You can discuss the monitoring arrangements then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Moving on to clause 3. The council has explained that biodiversity opportunity areas in Berkshire were identified in 2008, and that they're not intended to represent a constraint upon development, but rather to identify areas where there is most opportunity for habitat creation. The council proposes then to refer to those biodiversity opportunity areas specifically in clause 3, but to recognise that these might eventually be replaced by a similar designation under a different name. And that seems like a reasonable proposal to me. Does anyone else have any different views or comments on clause 3? No, excellent. So a note for the council to action that, please.
Yes, madam, that's fine. We're happy to do that.
Thank you. So I've got nothing further on NR2. Did anyone else want to make any other comments on NR2 before we leave it? No, thank you. Right, I'm going to move on to NR5 because it's next on my agenda, but then I will turn back to the other 2 policies about which I have no further questions in case anybody else does. So if we move on now to NR5, which is renewable energy. Okay, so I've put on here the status of the wind mapping exercise maps if they're not shown on the policies map, and whether this complies with the written ministerial statement, the WMS of 2015. So I've read your statement. I just want to say here, I'm not trying to be unnecessarily awkward. It seems to me that the work has been done. It's just making you aware, just the thoughts that are in my mind, and it might be completely fine as it is. But my question is, I suppose, notwithstanding that they're complex, has the council complied with the WMS by leaving the wind mapping exercise maps in the supporting evidence rather than showing them on the policies map? That's the overall question. But then, as I say, I'm not trying to be awkward. I think the work has been done. Has it been a problem how it is presented? If it doesn't, and is it likely to be a problem? Is this something I need to be worried about, basically?
Okay, madam. Well, to answer your final question, I would say no, you don't need to be worried about it. But I'll try to explain why very briefly, as you without repeating everything we said in our written statement. But as you say, an assessment was made, maps were prepared to show the potential suitability for wind energy development across the borough for medium and large scale wind development, that there is some text in the submitted plan to provide further explanation for that. But in terms of why this is not considered to be suitable for the insertion on the policies map, and I had another look at these maps that were prepared some years ago, yesterday in preparation, and they are very clearly, they would be very challenging indeed to include those on the policies map. I don't know whether you have a chance to look at them yourself, but what I can, however, say is that these maps, we believe this to be the case. It's not been 100% confirmed, but we believe that the maps would become part of the future supplementary planning document on climate change adaptation and mitigation. And if that does happen, it would ensure that the maps are given sufficient status in the determination of planning applications for wind energy development, of which I believe there are not that many.
Thank you. Anyone else on this matter? Okay, thank you. So does anyone want to speak on policy NR3, which is NR2 in the submitted plan, trees, woodland and hedgerows? Raise your hand now, otherwise I'll move on. No? Okay, NR4, habitats and designations. No. Okay, then I'll move on to this mineral safeguarding, which is the last point on my agenda. Okay, so you can read there are adequate protections in place for windfall development in advance of the emerging joint minerals and waste plan. Again, this is another relatively minor point, but this concerns paragraph 12.2.18 of the plan, which I felt was out of place. And the council agrees, and the reference will be moved to follow policy NR5. You can do that as an additional modification, doesn't need to form part of the main modification schedule. Not a matter of soundness really where it appears. Now, my question is, I suppose your statement explains that the joint minerals and waste plan in preparation will provide the necessary policy requirements covering this issue, and that site-specific requirements are incorporated into the pro formas for the relevant site allocations. So in advance of the minerals and waste plan, are any policy requirements necessary in respect of windfall sites, or are there sufficient protections in the currently adopted minerals local plan?
Thank you. I can answer that. First of all, just a very brief amount of context. Paragraph 143 of the framework states that local plans should define mineral safeguarding areas, so that known locations of mineral resources are not needlessly sterilised by non-mineral development. As you may know, the key mineral deposit in the borough is sand and gravel, and there is the potential for new surface development to be proposed on or close to these important mineral deposits. So the new joint Central and Eastern Berkshire Minerals and Waste Plan is at a fairly advanced stage now, currently undergoing its Regulation 19 consultation. This is expected to be submitted this winter and adopted by the end of 2021. So policy M2 of the proposed submission, new minerals and waste plan, seeks to safeguard sand and gravel resources from unnecessarily sterilisation. Okay, so the council has included, as you said, a requirement within the proposed changes plan for site pro formas with allocations that include at least 3 hectares of land within mineral safeguarding area for the mineral assessment to be undertaken for prior extraction. This will ensure this is taken into account. So moving to the specific point, the council, yes, so the council certainly agrees that the text is in the wrong place and can be moved. Now, in terms of, there is actually, should be noted that policy 2 of the currently adopted Berkshire Minerals Plan 2001 does seek to prevent the sterilisation of mineral deposits on development sites. And there are again some clauses that where that wouldn't happen. But so I really just wanted to emphasise that this is not a new concept that's being introduced into the new Minerals and Waste Plan. There's already provisions in the existing mineral plan for safeguarding. So were windfall developments to come forward within the mineral safeguarding areas ahead of the adoption of the joint Minerals and Waste Plan, which will not be that far in the future, policy 2 of the minerals plan can be used to secure prior extraction of the sand and gravel in appropriate circumstances.
Thank you, Ms. Luttrell. Ms. Elson's got her hand up. Ms. Els?
Sorry, computer wasn't playing game there. European Property Ventures would just like to advise the inspector regarding the safeguarding designation across their site at Datchet, HA41. I think it's probably pertinent given the council's consideration of windfall sites and also our request for reassessment of the sites. In terms of the emerging minerals and waste plan, we will be submitting representations to the council, which we will provide you with a copy of, that actually details how our discussions with CEMEX have identified that the site's sand and gravels can be extracted relatively easily. CEMEX are operating the Datchet quarry to the north of the M4 in very close proximity to our site. They have agreed that our site does have sand and gravel, which would provide them with about 12 months supply and would take about a year to extract. Now, obviously, what we will be doing through the sand and gravel assessment as part of the Minerals and Waste Plan is demonstrating that if our site were to come forward through windfall development or as an allocation, that the aggregate on site can be safely removed as part of development. But also the reinstatement and restoration of an excavated site can be undertaken, and an engineered site would result that would be able to provide flood attenuation and development areas that would really be part of the site's restoration. Obviously, removal of the aggregates from a safeguarded areas in accordance with planning policy, but that would substantially alter the topsoil on site through its removal, and also have implications in terms of the agricultural land quality. Now, through previous discussions and also HA41's assessment by the council, it has been identified by the council alone as best and most versatile. Obviously, you'll be aware from our previous examinations and our statements that we have submitted information and evidence that doesn't agree with this throughout the site's promotion. Obviously, as part of this, the safeguarding of the site and intended extraction of sand and gravel, that agricultural land designation would fall away. So in terms of my client's proposals for this site, it will be to take advantage of that safeguarding and to remove the sand and gravel. That's with or without an allocation, but obviously the remediation of the site to a development is our chosen focus at this point.
Thank you. Thank you. Would the council like to come back on any of those points?
No, thanks. No, we wouldn't like. We don't feel the need to respond to those points.
Thank you. Okay, that's everything, I think, then, for that session. Thank you very much for your contributions. So we'll adjourn now. The next session is matter 9, at 2:30. Thank you very much.